Hey guys, this is John, and welcome to part 3 in my series on fundamental chess concepts. So in the first two parts, we talked about undefended pieces and piece coordination. And what we're going to do in this one is bring that together and also talk about typical mistakes that you see at the level that this series is directed towards. And that's beginning players, improving players, I'd say players up to, maybe 12 to 1400. It's hard to know for sure because these things come up at even higher levels, but they're most pervasive at, I'd say, the below 1200 level. So in order to do that, I have enlisted the help of one of my students. And this is my student right here. Handsome looking guy, right? His name is Zach. He's from the US. And Zach wrote to me a couple months ago and said that he, probably like many people watching this video, is interested in chess and he likes chess a lot. He can beat his friends, but when he plays online, he has a tougher time, and he tends to get smashed, according to him. So he was looking for ways to improve, and what I really like about Zach is that he had a great attitude towards improvement just right off the bat. And he seems to take losses in stride very well, and even though he's a relatively new player, he is embracing a lot of the things that we've talked about in our lessons, and we've been working together since October. So I enlisted his help, and he's agreed to let me use some of his recent games and examples from his play. And he's also agreed to play a few games on video for us, where he's going to be playing the games, and I'm going to be commenting while he's playing. You guys won't see or hear him at all, but you'll just hear me. But I'll be observing his games and commenting on his games. So that will be the second half of the video. Before we do that, though, and by the way, Zach is his standard rating is 1235. His blitz rating is about 900. Okay, so that's kind of where he's at. So I'd put him at 900 to 1,000 if he were to play over the board chess. I think that would be about where he's rated at the moment. So let's go to our first position, and this is just a little warm-up position. It's from one of Zach's games. He actually emailed me about this game shortly after he played it because he was white, and he really liked the way that he had played this one, but he committed a typical mistake, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video. Typical mistakes and common things that come up in the course of play for these improving players. So he was white here. It was his opponent's move, and his opponent, seeing the threat of mate on g7, aka queen takes g7, played the move queen g8, addressing that threat. So if you want to pause your video, you can try to figure out what white should do in reply. So Zach is white here. What should he do in reply to queen g8? And I'll give you guys a second to think about that. Again, pause your video if you want to think about it at length. Okay, so this is somewhat of a trick question, and it's interesting. I'm doing a video on typical mistakes, and I'm leading with an example that it's hard to categorize it as a typical mistake because this is something that could happen at any level, even all the way up to world champion. But if you said queen takes h6 with the intention of bishop takes h6, rook takes h6 checkmate, you would have actually predicted what happened in the game, minus the checkmate part, and you would have committed a mistake. Okay, so Zach was thinking that after sacrificing his queen, that he would be able to come over with his rook, and black would be in bad shape because he'd have to block the check with the queen, and from there, it would be checkmate in 2. So something like this, and then this would be checkmate. However, you guys can see that after queen takes h6, bishop takes h6, this comes with check. So black is actually responding to a check with a check of their own. And needless to say, black, or Zach, completely missed this idea as white in this position. He missed the fact that it would be a check. He was so excited about his potential combination that it totally escaped him that, hey, I could have problems with my own king. And I don't want to read too far into this because, again, this could happen at any level. I've done this sort of thing before too. But it's a problem of overlooking the opponent's threat and underestimating your own, or overestimating your threat and underestimating your opponent's defensive resources, basically. So, logically speaking, a decent move for white if they wanted to prepare the threat of queen takes h6 instead would be king f2. So that would be a good way to sidestep any potential future problems on the g file and still set up queen takes h6 as a threat. If you suggested an even stronger move, like I believe the strongest move of all in this position would be rook d to d7, then good job to you, because this would attack the bishop 3 times, and if the bishop moves, which it honestly doesn't even have any good moves, but if it did, let's say it takes this pawn, then rook h7 is going to be lights out. Queen takes rook, rook takes checkmate, or queen takes h7 checkmate. So those would have been better moves. But basically, when you feel like you're in a position where you're about to deliver the decisive blow, like you can sense blood, you can smell the blood, and the sharks are circling around your opponent's position, you always want to make sure, if you have enough time on your clock, that you fully consider the defensive resources that your opponent may have. And just double check, double and triple check if you can. Make sure you're not missing any in-between move or unexpected idea they have to derail your idea, basically. So, thought that was just an interesting little warm-up problem. Now, we're going to look at a couple games that I have reviewed with Zach recently, and I thought were illustrative of typical mistakes. And the first one is a game he played. I believe this was either a 10-minute or a 15-minute game, and I'm going to upload it now. We're going to be looking at this from the black side. So Zach was black in this game, and he's playing a guy, Luke Carney 2409. I think this guy might have been a little bit higher rated than him, but not by much. And Zach actually decided to play the Scandinavian defense. I gotta say, I didn't encourage him to play this opening. Even though you guys know this is one of my favorite openings for black, he decided to play this on his own. And this game was interesting because white did something that you see a lot. And that is, white decided to move many of their pawns early on. And I've mentioned this in another chess fundamental video. I think it was the first video, that you see this all the time at this level. And that's one side making way too many pawn moves in the opening. So I wanted to show you how Zach played against that and how he could potentially have played better. Okay, so the game went e4, d5, e5. This already is a slight mistake for white, pushing the pawn. Taking the pawn is much better, because if he were to take it, then after queen takes, then white can start winning tempos on black's queen. Pushing it is not a very challenging reply. And here, this will give us a chance to talk about coordination as well, because black played e6. Now, what do you think is the criticism of this move as far as black's coordination goes? So, if you watch my last video, what would I say about this move e6, and why is it suboptimal? Okay, so the reason why e6 is not the best move is that it blocks in black's light square bishop. And it was unprompted, too. You know, in some openings, like let's say the French defense, where it goes e4, e6, d4, d5, black is saddled with a problematic light square bishop just by design. You know, that's just part of the opening. It's not really... When you play e6 on move 1, you're kind of setting yourself up for difficulties with that bishop. You know, that's just how the opening goes. But in this position, even though e6 is a perfectly logical looking move, and it does allow him to develop this dark square bishop and fortifies the center, it was kind of an unnecessary coordination error, right? So I suggested to him that a better move would be bishop f5, kind of playing in the spirit of a Caro-Kann. In the Caro-Kann, black often does this, in the advanced variation especially. But let's say after d4, then playing e6. So in choosing this move order, he could get his bishop outside of the pawn chain and then play the e6 move, and he hasn't disrupted his development in any major way. So he's getting the best of both worlds. He's playing the move he intends to play in the center, but he's liberating his bishop first. So e6, and now his opponent played d4, and actually we've transposed to a French defense. Now, another typical mistake that I talked about in the last video, and Zach has a tendency to do this, so we'll see if he does this today, too, in the games that I'm going to be commenting on of his. So he played the move knight c6. And if you want to ask yourself what is the flaw with this move, you can pause your video and do so now. Okay, the flaw with this move is that it blocks black's c-pawn. By playing knight c6, he blocks this pawn, and that is significant because this pawn would have been a very useful attacker of white's center. So if black plays c5, which if you play the French, you would know that this is the main move here. If black plays c5, you can bring the knight behind, and you can use both the pawn in front and the knight behind to put pressure on d4. And really white's entire central construction, because in putting pressure on d4, you also put pressure on e5. There can be a real domino effect if this structure becomes weakened. So even though knight c6 develops a piece quickly, and we like quick developing moves in the opening, it was better coordination-wise to play c5 and put the knight behind it. And that's a situation we run into quite often with the c-pawn and the knight. If you can, it's usually better to have the c-pawn in front with the knight behind it, because that gives you more of a chance to influence matters in the center. And I mentioned last video, this happens more in d-pawn openings, but here's an example from an e-pawn opening where it occurs. So c5 would have been a good idea. Usually white goes c3, black can bring the knight behind it, and then black seeks to pressure the d4 pawn, usually with queen b6 to come. Okay, so Zach played knight c6. Now his opponent makes another pawn move, f4. This pawn move is not so bad because it helps defend his e5 pawn. He's staking out space. Also, maybe his knight will come to f3 and he avoids the problem of having the knight in front of the pawn. It's not usually as significant on this wing, but f4 is not a bad move. So here, Zach makes another mistake that I see all the time, and he played bishop b4 check. So this is something new that we haven't really talked about, but a rule of thumb is that if you're thinking about making a minor piece move into your opponent's half of the position, especially if it's early in the game, you should think carefully, and the minor piece move that you're considering will usually not be good if they can easily push you away with a pawn. So if they can just play a move like c3 in this case, which is exactly what white played, then that minor piece move is not normally accomplishing much of anything, because you're going to have to move it again. It's under attack, and your opponent has probably played a useful move with a gain of time. So the times that a minor piece move, whether it's a bishop or especially a knight, because it often happens with knights, the times that those are good are when your opponent can't move a pawn up to attack it, and it actually creates some sort of threat for you, and the piece is stable. Okay, if the piece is stable and you think you can support it, then it's an outpost, and it's not just like a semi-random minor piece move into their position. So I might have actually touched on this in a previous video. I can't remember, but let's say white's pawns were already up here, so the pawns were on c4 and a4. Well, then a bishop move to b4 or a knight move to b4 may not be so bad. It would probably still wouldn't be the best possible move, but it might not be a bad idea because the pawns would already be past the b4 square, and they would not be able to kick whatever minor piece black opts to move to that square. They wouldn't be able to kick it away. But moves like bishop b4 or knight b4, unless it's for a really specific reason, I would not do those moves because you can just get kicked back with the pawn. And you don't see good players playing those moves. So bishop b4 check was played. His opponent played c3. So even though white's made a lot of pawn moves so far, I would actually say thus far into the game, they were justified. I don't think any particular pawn move he's made, with the exception of maybe e5 on move 2, was that bad. So c3. Now, Zach should probably just move his bishop back to e7. And then, even though that blocks his knight from coming to e7, he could try to get this knight out via h6 then in the future. But he played bishop a5. Maybe he was trying to keep this bishop active. But watch what happens. White gets to push pawns, and he's doing it with a gain of time again. So he plays b4. Zach's like, oh no, my bishop's under attack. I better move it. And he does. Here white played a4. And I know many people watching this video will have experienced this type of pawn storm where your opponent is trying to trap in your bishop. So again, white's done another move with tempo, and he's threatening pawn to a5 now. So that would trap Zach's bishop. So he played a6. Good move. He could also consider a5. I think I like a6 a little bit better because with a6, if his opponent plays b5 to attack the knight, then Zach can take. And now a takes b5 would be a horrible blunder for white because Zach could reply with rook takes rook. So if he had played a5 instead, then b5 would be possible with another tempo gainer on the knight. So a6, perfectly fine. So white played a5 in response to that, attacking the bishop again. The bishop came here. Now finally, Luke Carney decides to develop a piece. Plays bishop e3. Decent move. If it were me, I'd probably play knight f3 to start, because I think if you have a choice between kingside development and queenside development, you should choose kingside development. That's a general rule, but given how many pawns white has pushed on the queen side, it's very unlikely that they will castle on that wing. So I think, all things considered, knight f3 would be better. And we like moving knights before bishops. That's the rule, too. So I think knight f3 would be better than, let's say, bishop d3. So, but he played bishop e3. Zach played knight ge7, good developing move. Now his opponent played g4, another pawn move. Okay, so this is the first move I can legitimately criticize white about, because I think this is getting a little flagrant. This is a little too much. He would be better off developing his pieces and playing knight f3 or maybe knight d2. But he played g4. I kind of wonder if his opponent played that in order to stop Zach from playing knight f5, because knight f5 would be a good outpost square. The black knight could jump in there potentially with tempo on the e3 bishop. So maybe white was doing that. But now black has a really big lead in development, and he's almost entirely coordinated. He's got some problems remaining, like the light square bishop, which we know will probably be a problem for several moves. Also, black's not castled. But I could see within the next, let's say 2 to 5 moves, black really capitalizing on his lead in development. Okay? And I'll be curious to see what you guys think black should do. And let's see. So Zach castled now. Good move. His opponent played h4. So let's see right here. And I'm actually going to turn off the notation just so you guys can't see what happened. Black to move. So black is better developed. We know that. White has now succeeded in moving all of his pawns. And I told Zach when we were reviewing this game that this is one of the few games I've seen where someone manages to move like all their pawns and not end up in like a horrible position quite yet. So if you were black, how would you play the position at this point? You can pause your video if you like. How do you recommend black play? You could either suggest a single move or, better yet, a plan for black. Okay, so in this position, it would be to black's benefit to start trying to open up the position. So start ripping open the board, if possible. Maybe I shouldn't put it in such violent terms. He should try to choose a spot or an area of the board where he thinks he can achieve a pawn break in the hopes of opening lines and using his better development, using his lead in development. Because if we look at this now, so black has 1, 2, 3 minor pieces out, and he's already castled. White has 1 minor piece out, he's uncastled. So that's a solid 3 tempo development advantage that black has. Granted, Zach has a little less space right now because white has made it his priority to advance all these pawns and grab space, but black has a real lead in development. And that lead in development will be less significant if he keeps operating in a closed position, that is black, if black keeps operating in a closed position. So he should seek to open the position now in order to try to make sure that his pieces can actually prove their worth, the pieces that he's developed. Also, opening the position will help him fight back against his opponent's space advantage too. So it's like a dual purpose strategy. So I'm going to reload the game now. And the primary way that you open a position is with pawn breaks. Okay, so a pawn break is where you move one of your pawns and offer to exchange one of your opponent's pawns. Okay, so here there's a couple different pawn breaks, and it's helpful to identify them if you're able to do so. Very good job. So the 2 pawn breaks are f6 and b6. Those are the pawn moves where black could offer direct contact with white's pawns, and it would achieve the effect of opening the position, no matter what happens. So in this position, f6 is a better move than b6, because b6 leaves the a6 pawn a little bit weakly defended. I'm going to be talking about b6 again in a few minutes, but I think, given the position, f6 is a much better move, and I think it's great that Zach recognized that, and he played that move. His rook is already positioned on the f-file. Some people would be hesitant to move the f-pawn. I've called it the forget about it pawn, but once you've castled, it's not as bad of an idea to move that pawn. And since this attacks e5 as well, I think it's a great move. So f6 is an excellent move, and he's forcing white to make a decision, like either take, which might allow the rook to come up and start, participating in the attack, or allow black to take. Either way, lines are becoming open. The board is becoming a bit more open, and black can hope to use his development edge that way. So his opponent responded by playing g5. Now, let's see if you guys can spot the undefended piece tactic. Excuse me, my throat is already getting dry. But let's see if you guys can spot the undefended piece tactic that black has here. So black to move and win a pawn. You can pause your recording. So black to move and win a pawn. The solution is f takes e5, which would prompt white to play f takes e5 himself. And now, because this bishop is undefended on e3, undefended piece, black can play this nice move, knight takes e5. And does everyone see why that works? If white takes the knight, black's bishop, which has been lurking on a7, is finally free, and he can take this bishop on e3. And black has a fantastic position. He's up a pawn. He's succeeded in opening the board. This file for the rook is now open too. White has no development at all. And if black plays this properly, he will win this game at this point. So notice how that tactic is initiated by black playing to open the position. F takes e5. Playing to open lines. And I wanted to stop and talk about this for a second because Zach played a move that kind of runs counter to this strategy. So unfortunately, Zach now played f5. And hopefully, based on the discussion we've been having here, you can identify why this is a mistake. It's a mistake because it shuts down the position. It completely locks up the position. And now black's development advantage is a lot less noticeable. So he played for a pawn break with f6, but just when he had the opportunity to open it up, he kind of abruptly switched courses and he changed his mind and played f5. So we were discussing this moment, Zach and I, at length when we reviewed this game during our most recent lesson. And I think he did realize once we talked about it why f5 was a mistake and why it led to his problems in this game. And I think he basically lost this game because of this move, f5, because he has a very cramped position after this. So f takes e5 would have been the way to open the position and use his development advantage to the maximum. So after f5, his opponent played h5. Now, as far as pawn breaks go, black only has this b6 pawn break on the other wing, and I don't think he's going to be wanting to play h6 or g6 anytime soon because that's where his king is. Contrary to the f-pawn situation, I think h6 or g6 would be extremely dangerous here. Moreover, even if black does play h6, it's white's call whether white wants to open it or not. White could take and open the g file, but they could also just play g6 and keep it closed. So the ball is no longer in Zach's court to open the king side. So after h5, Zach played bishop d7, just developing. Bishop d3. This is a tough position. He's fully coordinated. It doesn't seem like he's done anything wrong. His king is safe, but there's no real plan to speak of. And there's a great book by this Swedish IM, Axel Smith, called Pump Up Your Rating. And he talks about how if you don't have a pawn break in a position, especially a closed and semi-closed position, if you don't have a pawn break, you typically don't have a plan. He says no pawn break, no plan. And I think in this position, that is absolutely true. Because if black can't open the position, what does his development lead matter? Why is that significant at all? It shouldn't be. We're basically opting for trench warfare at this point, the way that black has played it. And white is perfectly happy to do that because he has all these far-flung pawns that guarantee him a space advantage, and he can calmly bring his pieces into the game now that there's no direct threats. So black played queen e8. I think I'm going to scroll through the rest of this game fairly quickly. You see, he tried to play b6 and open the position. Unfortunately, it just wasn't that good for him after this. Yeah, he ended up losing his a6 pawn, and his position slid downhill. He kind of missed the boat on his counterplay. b5, yeah, this lost a pawn. So that's another thing that Zach needs to work on, as with virtually everyone in this rating range. So undefended pieces, he just advanced the pawn and it was attacked 3 times. Just gave it to white, essentially. I think he was trying to win that a6 pawn. Here, white tried to open up the king side. Here I think Zach should have played g6 and kept the position closed. He played knight b3, rook b1. H takes g7 was also possible. Bishop takes a6, and ended up dropping his queen. Yeah, so undefended piece situation again. And soon lost. So very interesting stuff going on in the opening in this one. And just to kind of sum up, few coordination problems at the beginning. e6 did not allow the bishop to come to f5. So Zach and I discussed that. We also discussed about the role of having the c pawn in front of the knight and why that was so important. And the pawn break issues and how you can play against an opponent who is moving a bunch of pawns. The way you want to play against such an opponent is time your pawn breaks. Look for ways to open the position and cash in on your development advantage. Because if you are just content to just kind of develop and not put any pressure on them in response to them pushing pawns, you're going to have a rough time. They're going to have their way with you, because the people who push pawns a lot, they're typically aggressive players, and they know that pushing pawns bothers most players in this rating range. So the way that you want to take advantage of that is build a solid position, time your pawn break like f6, just like Zach did, and be ready to cash in. And if he hadn't played that f5 move and had instead opted for this, I really like his chances to win. Okay, the next game we're going to look at is a game that Zach played against a guy named Rutabegas. So this was a win by Zach, and I really like this one. In this game, we're going to be talking about squares. Okay, so in this game, Zach played the Sicilian, and his opponent played c4. Now, it's a big revelation for many players at this level to think in terms of squares rather than pieces. So most people are thinking what can my pieces do, or what are my pieces attacking? And that's fine to think that way. However, as you're climbing the rating ladder, you'll start thinking more in terms of squares. So when white plays c4, an experienced player will see that this significantly weakens a square for white. And if you want to, ask yourself, which square is that? Which square is white weakening by playing c4? The answer is the d4 square. And the reason why is that white has pushed these 2 pawns, and both of those pawn pushes bypass the d4 square. So it means that this d4 square can no longer be contested by one of white's pawns. It can only be defended by a piece, aka a knight on f3. And because of that, that's a prime outpost square for black. And coincidentally, his knight is only 2 moves away from being able to jump in there. Now, black doesn't necessarily have to go into that square right away, but when white plays c4, he should be aware of the fact that this square is weak. White also has a backward pawn on d2. So the way that black would want to develop now, if he could, would be centered around that square. So Zach played his standard move here, which is d6, but I personally would have played knight c6. And if allowed, let's just say white plays some random developing move, I would actually fianchetto my dark square bishop. This is a good strategy in the Sicilian. If your opponent's not playing d4, you can try to fianchetto your dark square bishop so as to clamp down on the d4 square, because chances are, by fianchettoing it, you're increasing your control over that square. So the d4 square will be a big one coming up in this game. So instead, black played d6, white played d3. Zach started developing, knight f6. Opponent played bishop e2. Here, Zach played e5, which is not a terrible move, because actually it does help better defend d4, gain control over that square. However, he now suffers the same problem. His d5 square can no longer be defended by a pawn. So since d4 was already within his grasp, maybe after a move like knight c6, maybe he should have kept the pawn back and possibly even thought about putting it on e6 later, so that if this knight ever gets the idea of coming in, he can put a stop to that. But again, e5, not a major mistake. So white developed. Zach played bishop e7. Now bishop e6. I think it would have been slightly better for him to castle or play knight c6 maybe. I'm not a huge fan of moving the queenside bishop before you've like developed your knights or castled. I think that's usually a piece you want to wait on. But he played bishop e6, knight c3, castle, b3. Both sides have been doing great about their undefended pieces. Both sides are developing in a way that they're overprotecting weak points. Like a weak point for black could be d6 because that's a backward pawn, but he's got it protected twice. Ditto for white, it's also protected. So it's a closed position. So now here he plays knight e8. This was an interesting move, and this is a good example of a move that the reasoning for it is kind of lost when you're just playing through the game. Now, if I were playing through a GM game and I saw this move knight e8, I would automatically assume that the reason black was doing it was to try to prepare the move pawn to f5. But because I know Zach's a basically beginning player, and he's not playing at a GM level yet and won't for a long time, I asked him why he played that move, and he actually said that the reason why he played this move was because he felt uncomfortable with his bishop on e7. He felt like this piece was cramped, and he was playing this move to give the bishop more options. And I think he even pointed out the g5 square as one he might want to go to eventually. And I told him that, that's an interesting idea, like trying to liberate the bishop, but I would have liked to see you complete your development first. So I suggested knight c6, like complete your development before you worry about improving the prospects of a piece that you already have in the game. I did tell him that I liked knight e8 in the context of trying to play f5, because again, no pawn break, no plan. So if he is doing that to go for f5 to try to like knock out one of white's center pawns, then I like that. But his reasoning for playing knight e8 was a little flawed. His opponent jumped into the d5 square. I would probably take this knight pretty soon, because it's not a piece that you want to tolerate until the end of time. So giving up the bishop for the knight would not be a bad idea right now. That would also double white's pawns, so that's okay. He instead played queen d7. White played knight g5, attacking the bishop. And he went back to f6. Again, he's taking some liberties and not developing this knight. Again, like on all these moves, I probably would have played knight c6 myself. Take. And now queen d2. He played h6. White captured here. And now in this position, I think black has a good case for taking with the f-pawn, because that would fortify his center a little bit, and it also opens the f-file. It's kind of a minor point, but this capture is usually acceptable. Instead, he took with the queen, and white played queen e3. Now, this position here, this is an interesting one. So think about for a moment which side you would prefer at this point. So if someone came up to you on the street and asked you to evaluate this position, they asked your opinion, who would you say is better and why? Okay, so it's kind of a close call. And even though white has the two bishops, they have the bishop pair, and that is an advantage most of the time, the position is closed enough where if you chose black and his pair of knights, I would not hold it against you at all. And the general rule is the more pawns that are on the board, the more closed the position is, the more the knight is increasing in value compared to the bishops. Okay, so follow-up question. Let's say this position's like dynamically equal. Maybe even though the position's closed, we like white's chances with the bishop. Let's think about the coming strategic battle. If you could potentially trade one of black's knights for one of white's bishops, you're playing black, and you just have the option of trading one of your knights for one of black's bishops. Which bishop would you trade off? Would you want to trade the light square bishop or the dark square bishop? And also, for bonus points, which knight would you want to trade off? Best decision, if you had the option to do so, would be to get rid of white's dark square bishop and get rid of your f6 knight. Now, in this position, that's almost total fantasy. That's not going to happen because the circumstances for that to happen are not apparent right now and can't be brought about easily. But it's helpful to think in those terms because this is a closed position. There's not going to be any immediate tactic, more than likely. However, we can start thinking strategically and try to form a basis for our plan. And getting rid of white's dark square bishop would be excellent because of this d4 square. So that square is like the perfect outpost for black's knight. And coincidentally, this knight is very close to being able to get there. Again, it's 2 moves away. Knight c6 to d4. And if you could get your knight in without fear of it ever being exchanged by this bishop, by playing like bishop b2 and taking on d4, then that could be like a permanent strategic advantage for black. If we adjust this position slightly, get rid of these guys, stick this knight on d4, that changes the assessment entirely. Black is much, much better now. This knight dominates that bishop. This knight can't be removed. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So that may impact how black plays. So like instead of playing knight c6, which would be a good move here, Zach actually played knight g4. Notice he's already moved this knight around a lot. He played it back to e8, and then to f6, and now to knight to g4. And in doing so, he offered white a chance to trade off their bad bishop, the light square bishop, which white did. White didn't have to do this, but they could. Actually, queen g3 would be a pretty good move too. But white was probably not super unhappy to part with the light square bishop because look how many pawns white has on light squares. This may not be the best piece in the world. It's not the worst piece in the world either, but as far as bishop value goes, I think the dark square bishop is much better. So knight g4, there was a trade. White played f3. Now that he has no light square bishop, he doesn't mind putting pawns on light squares. Zach brought the queen back. Here white did a pawn break, f4. Now Zach, he told me he was worried about white potentially playing f5. So for that reason, he played f5 himself, which, given that he hasn't completed his development, was a little risky. Granted, white hasn't moved this bishop either, but I really would have liked to see him play that knight c6 move. So f5 was played. Now white took here, and at this point Zach realized that if he took on e5, he would have an undefended pawn, which white could take. Undefended pawn on c5. So he instead chose a developing move, a good one, knight c6. White took on d6. He came over with his queen. Now, black is down a pawn, but his coordination has improved a lot. He's got his knight into the game. This rook can be posted actively, which he did on the very next move. White took a second pawn, but he was met by this move, rook a e8. Now black is like doing awesome in the coordination department. He just played this move with tempo on white's queen as well. And this was the decisive moment of the game, practically. White played queen f4, offering a queen trade. Black, knowing that he's down material, decided not to do that, and instead grabbed a undefended pawn. So Zach took on d3. Now white played bishop a3. And at this point, rook takes f5 was played, and Zach was kind of hitting himself on the head because that was an undefended piece error. Oh, by the way, one other thing I wanted to mention here. If white had played a move like, let's say, queen h3, what could black do in reply? Black to move and win. The answer is queen d4 check. So hitting the king with tempo and also zeroing in on that undefended rook. So this would win black a piece. Just thought I'd point that out. So queen f4 was played instead, and then take, and then bishop a3. Now in this position, I think I was recommending in the post-mortem that Zach play knight d4. I thought this would be a very nice move to get the knight into that prime central square and also threaten knight e2. But unfortunately, Zach made a big mistake now. He played rook takes f5, just miscounting the number of attackers. This pawn was defended twice by white's queen and rook, and it was attacked twice, but that escaped his attention. So rook takes f5, queen took. He did avoid the queen trade now. Queen d4 check, king h1. Now black is losing, unfortunately, but this wasn't the end of the story. I'll just show the rest of the game because Zach's my student. I want to show one of his wins. And he actually lost the other rook. But guess what happened, guys? He starts trying for a desperate counterattack. White's still up a rook and a bishop. And a miracle happens. White plays queen f7, completely overlooking the attack on his undefended piece. And Zach jumped on it. Queen takes d1. White has to block with the queen. Queen takes f1 checkmate. So a huge turnaround and swindle by Zach. But the main thing was the play leading up to this. And I think this one was interesting just in terms of the central squares, especially the role that d4 square played virtually from move 2 when white played c4 and significantly weakened that. Hopefully this could help those Sicilian players who are accustomed to facing lines where white does not go into the open Sicilian, which is this. Because when they don't go into the open Sicilian, chances are the d4 square could be a square you might control. And thinking strategically about squares is a big step in your chess development. Thinking about squares and weak squares can influence like how you position your pieces in the middle game. Remember, we were talking about like this set position right here, and how black would want to play, what pieces would be good to exchange, which ones would be good to keep if you're white, things like that. So I think now I'm going to wrap up this portion of the video where we're just talking about past games that Zach has played, and we're going to get in on some live games that he's playing, and I'm going to comment over those. So talk to you guys again soon. Hey guys, okay, so the second part of this video we'll be watching Zach play 2 games, and I instructed him to look for 10 minutes with a 5-second increment. So these are technically blitz games, but they're a little bit longer. And I'm just going to be live commenting, and yeah, we'll see what happens. And I hope there'll be a lot of instructive moments in this one. So he has played the Sicilian defense, and his opponent responded with g3 on move 2. So opting for a fianchetto. And looks like white's treating the position a little unusually so far. Zach has played some pretty standard moves with d6 and knight f6. And it looks like after c3, his opponent is trying to go d4. And by the way, Zach knows that he's being recorded while he's playing these. So I do wonder if that will affect his play, if he'll be playing more carefully than usual. I should say I have no contact with him during this game. I was talking to him on Skype just to tell him like what time control to look for, but he is not hearing any of this. So we're getting his pure, unadulterated thought process. And I like what he's doing so far. His development is good. He's brought his knights out to the center. And his opponent, on the other hand, is almost like freestyling his development a little bit. So knight a3, that was possibly in response to him having put the pawn on c3. So he's choosing to develop his knight to the side of the board. And I like the fact that Zach is taking his time. You know, they both played the first several moves pretty fast. Okay, so this move d5, this is an interesting thing that Zach is doing. So he's moving his d-pawn for the second time, but he is trying to take out his opponent's e4 pawn. Now, in past videos in the Chess Fundamental series, I've talked about how you generally want to try to avoid moving the same piece twice, especially in the early stages. But I wonder if he's thinking that because white's playing a little unusually this opening, he can get away with that. So if he recognized that he was moving the pawn a second time, but thought it was justified because of the way his opponent is treating the opening, I like that decision. White's playing knight f3, so now white's catching up on development. I think Zach at this point should probably move his e-pawn and then develop his bishop to like e7, for instance. He played bishop g4, going to pin white's knight. That's also useful. The thing about this early development of the light square bishop is queen b3 could be annoying, because if you notice, by moving the bishop from c8 to g4, Zach is leaving the b7 pawn undefended. So white could potentially play queen b3 and try to take advantage of that. So I'll be curious to know if Zach considered that possibility. So his opponent responded with knight to c4. Now I really hope Zach moves his e-pawn and develops his dark square bishop so he can get ready to castle. I guess I wasn't a huge fan of him developing his queenside bishop before dealing with the kingside bishop, because the chances that he castles queenside are pretty low. Ooh, and Zach moved the forget about it pawn. Okay, this is a controversial move. So he moved the f pawn, which I call the forget about it pawn. And I think he did that probably to control the e5 square better, and he wants to move his pawn to e5. He could have played pawn e5 on the previous move, though, if I just go back here. If he had done that, it wouldn't have been that bad of a decision, because if white took with the knight, he would take back, and the other knight is pinned. So white would be unable to take because of the pin on the queen. So I'm not sure about f6. I don't know if that move was necessary. And you can see his opponent has just played queen b3, and now it might be dawning on Zach that he has some problems with his b-pawn. So let's see how he responds to that. Again, I like that he's taking his time. You know, he didn't blitz out a move in response to queen b3. I think he may recognize that his position is a bit precarious right now. So moves that would be good for him would be queen d7. I like that move a lot because that would defend two pieces that as of now are not defended yet. Okay, so he played bishop e6. Now, that appears to hang the pawn on b7. Okay, so I don't see why his opponent wouldn't take that. Maybe it was the case that Zach overlooked the attack on the b7 pawn and instead was thinking that white was playing queen b3 in order to like x-ray the knight on d5, for instance. But, it's hard to know for certain, but yeah, I'm fairly sure that he overlooked the attack on the b7 pawn. And he'll have to adjust if his opponent takes it. Bishop e6, not a fan of that move even without losing the pawn, because how is Zach going to develop this piece now? Bishop e6 very much interferes with his coordination. So if white takes here and the knight is under attack, he'll have to expend a tempo defending it, so something like rook c8. And after that, I think white can castle pretty easily, and he's going to have to figure out how to unwind, how to get this bishop in the game, and avoid further material loss. So rook c8 should probably be played. Queen c8 is another option. That would be another way to defend the knight on c6. Queen c8 offers a queen trade, and I know I've said before, and this is the general strategy that many people are aware of, if you're down in material, you should not be in a hurry to trade pieces. You should try to keep more pieces on the board so you have a better chance of fighting back. But given how active white's queen is, it may not be a bad idea for black to offer a trade. Okay, so Zach did respond to the threat. He played bishop back to d7, defending the knight. This does interfere with the defense of the knight on d5. So you guys can kind of see already, you know, I'm sure Zach is not liking the way he's played the opening at this point. But he's had some problems because of his undefended pieces. You know, it started way back on that queen b3 move. Also, like bishop g4 was a little bit loose too. That piece was undefended on that square, and he's already moved the bishop several times. So he's hit a couple things that we've talked about at length in the first two chess fundamentals videos. So the undefended pieces, he's had some trouble with that, moving the same pieces twice. His coordination is a problem because of like the bishop being on e6, blocking the e7 pawn, for instance. So this, I think, just highlights how common this is at this level. And even though Zach is aware of all this, because he's my student and I've been working with him and he's watched my two videos and we've talked about this stuff at length, it's not easy to accustom yourself to noticing this type of thing. So this is a great learning experience. Okay, now he's played pawn e5. Good. So I like his idea of trying to get the pawn up. The only problem I see with this move, and you guys might see it too, is there's a tactic white has based on one of black's undefended pieces. And if you want to try to find it, you can pause your video now and see. So the tactic is a knight capture on e5. And actually, I think either knight capture would work. I think this knight capture or that one would be sufficient, because both knight captures would open up an attack on the knight on d5. So, like if this knight took, then the bishop would be able to capture here. And likewise, if that knight took, the white queen would be opened up to take the knight here. So I wonder if his opponent will notice that. You see how the knight on d5, this undefended piece, is a magnet for tactics. Like suddenly two separate tactics work for white, both involving a discovered attack on this undefended piece. That's the effect of loose pieces. And okay, it looks like his opponent, Gerardo Feliz, found that move. And Zach is giving up some rating in this game too, so his opponent's about 125 points higher rated than him. Zach's a little bit higher in standard than he is in blitz. I think his standard rating is about 1250 or so. So I think he feels a little less comfortable at these shorter time controls. Okay, so he recaptured with his pawn. So now his opponent will take the knight on d5, and he's going to go up 2 pawns. Moreover, because black moved that f-pawn way back on, which move was it? Move number 8. He has some problems on this diagonal several moves later, and now it's a great mystery how black is going to castle. So Zach will have some problems with his king, undoubtedly. He already does have problems. Okay, I like this move, rook b8. So he gains a tempo on white's queen. He's trying to force it back. That also gets out of the pin that this bishop had him under. So he's playing a useful move with tempo. I really, really like that. White retreated all the way to d1. So now a move that would want to be on black's radar is queen h5 check, which would possibly embarrass black's king and maybe get at this pawn. Zach retreated the knight. Unfortunately, he has allowed a checkmate. Oh no. So his opponent has mate in 1 here, if you guys can find it. Yep, and his opponent found it. Knight d6, smothered checkmate. Ooh, okay. So not a great start for Zach. I'm sure he's kind of embarrassed at this moment. Game lasting 15 moves. But yeah, there's some problems he put himself into very early on in this one. So he, as we were saying, maybe even with this move d5, I'm not sure when he played d5 if he was fully grasping the consequences of that. Zach now just sent me a message on Skype. So he said, didn't even see that. Yeah, well, it happens sometimes. So I'm going to give him a little encouragement. So I'm actually going to tell him, so watch your undefended pieces and development / coordination in the next one. So just trying to give him some friendly advice and motivation before he plays this next game. He says, I couldn't ever get that dark square bishop out to castle. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, he had trouble doing that. So I'm going to say, you're right. Try to focus on developing your kingside pieces ASAP, as soon as possible, if you know you're going to castle on that wing. I'm doing this all off camera. You guys can't see it. You can probably hear me typing to him, but... Okay, so he's going to go ahead and play this second game, it seems like. All right. He said thank you, and he's going to be off again in another minute or two, hopefully. But yeah, there's... Okay, so he's got the second game. He's playing a 10-14, GM2 Gonzalez. Zach starts with d4. Okay, so he might be tightening up his game a little bit. He does play d4 on occasion. This is actually an opening he's been working on. So we'll see how he plays it. He plays e4 as well. I'm going to close... I'll leave that board up, actually. We might go back to that game. So his opponent has adopted a fianchetto setup. Zach's playing bishop d3. So Zach has been playing around with this so-called reverse stonewall variation, which I'm not a huge advocate of like systems, especially from the white side, aka playing a setup the same way against virtually everything your opponent does. But at lower levels, when you're just trying to master the basics and you're having trouble really grasping undefended pieces and playing a complete game without making huge blunders, I think it's okay to just play an opening you feel comfortable with. And he knows some of the main ideas in this line, so we'll see how he treats it. So his opponent is developing two of his bishops to these fianchetto squares. So Zach already has great control over the center. In fact, he could have been even more ambitious and played his pawn to e4 rather than e3, but that was way back on move 2 that he made that determination. So Zach and I have discussed this setup in the past, and if I were to ask you guys, in terms of coordination coming up, what is the piece that White's going to have trouble with? What is the piece that White might have difficulty introducing into the game? Okay, if you said the dark square bishop, you're right. So this piece is White's bad bishop in this game. And considering that White often plans to play c3, he'll then have like so many pawns on dark squares, and that bishop will have a hard time freeing himself. On the contrary, White's light square bishop is a very good piece. So that's a valuable one. He doesn't want to trade the light square bishop with reckless abandon. These knights protect each other. This knight has a good central influence on e5. It often jumps to e5 if it won't be kicked away easily. I noticed his opponent was like throwing his h-pawn down the board. So he played h5. Again, this is like very common. I see this on chess.com all the time at the lower levels. People like moving their pawns frequently in the opening, making too many pawn moves, often with like wing pawns, so knight pawns and rook pawns. I like the fact that Zach played h3 in this position. So he just put a stop to Black's h-pawn before it got too far, because if he had allowed that pawn to get to h3, then perhaps the light square bishop would be staring into White's position, and that could be a serious weakness on the long diagonal. So I like that he played h3 and just put a stop to the pawn's advance. Now his opponent played f5, so his opponent is fighting for a piece of the center now. Notice that Black has already made 1, 2, 3, 4, and if we count this as 2 pawn moves, 6 pawn moves already in the first 8 moves. So that's a lot. So Black has only moved his pawns and fianchettoed his bishop. Now, a move that Black might not want to see in this position is the move pawn to e4. And I'll be very curious to see if Zach tries to play that move in the coming moves, because I think that would be a great way to open up the center and try to exploit his lead in development, and also potentially get this bishop on a more accessible diagonal. Like maybe the bishop can come to e3 in the future after that. If we consider the weak points in Black's position and also the weak points in Zach's position here as White, what do we find? Well, Black has an undefended pawn on g6, so I might have liked to see Zach direct his knight there with knight e5 instead of knight g5. Then the knight could be taking a look at that undefended pawn. Also, if we back up a move here, h4 was rather weakly defended, so maybe he could have considered a move like queen e1 in order to hit that pawn on h4 a second time. And if I keep saying Black, but if Zach wanted to try to arrange the e4 pawn advance that we were talking about, queen e2 would be a constructive move to do that as well. And now here, okay, so his opponent has just played knight d5. What is he attacking? The e3 pawn. So this pawn is a weakness. When Zach played knight d2, that interfered with his dark square bishop defending that pawn. So I hope he picks up on the fact that e3 is attacked. Black also opened up an attack on Zach's knight on g5. However, that knight is defended by the f4 pawn, so he has that secure. So I hope any move that Zach plays next will be directed at defending this pawn. And I think a great move that hits a lot of goals for him would be queen e2. Knight f3, that also seems like a good move as well. I like that move too. So that allows the bishop to defend the pawn. And now he might be thinking that he has more harmonious knights. This one's on a pretty good outpost square. One thing I've mentioned to Zach is that you don't want to move your minor pieces into your opponent's half of the board early on unless they're adequately supported and they're on an outpost square. And I like that the fact that he has the knight on g5 supported by his pawn, and Black cannot kick this knight away with one of his pawns. Like if Black had a pawn back on f7 and h7, then it would be very easy for him to kick one of Zach's knights away, his knight away. So now, even though Black attacks the knight, Zach doesn't have much to fear because he has it defended twice. I hope to see Zach rip open the center. I would love to see him play e4 coming up. That would negate a defender of f4 because the e3 pawn is defending that. But remember, he's got this dark square bishop lurking there. So e4 would be a great way to exploit his lead in development. It would attack the black knight. If black were to capture on e4, then white could take with their bishop, and Zach would be attacking that weak g6 pawn. So let's see if he does that. He does have a significant advantage right now, and black has played some suboptimal moves in the opening. You know, he's made too many pawn moves, as we were discussing. He's created some weaknesses in his position. He's moved the same piece twice, like with this knight f6, knight d5 maneuver, and also with bishop g7 and now to h6. So black hasn't got his queenside knight out yet, and he hasn't castled. So this is prime territory for white to capitalize. And when you're opening up a position and trying to capitalize on a lead in development, often the best way to do that is with a pawn break and offering an exchange. A pawn break is usually just a pawn exchange. So moving one of your pawns up to force your opponent to capture and thereby open lines. So Zach played knight e5, and I think he was trying to zero in on that weakness of the g6 pawn, which I like. However, I'm not sure he realized that he was losing a defender of g5, and his opponent promptly captured on g5 in reply. So now if Zach takes back, which he should, his opponent will probably play queen takes g5, which incidentally will defend the g6 pawn. So there'll be the queen defending that guy. Now, all is not lost for Zach after that, but he'll have to be careful because the queen on g5 and this bishop on b7 lurking do create some pressure together on the g2 pawn. And in fact, after queen takes g5, the only thing stopping mate is this knight on d5. If black manages to move that knight, there may be a sudden attack and checkmate on g2. So I do see that if black takes the pawn on g5, then pawn e4 is possible for him, and I think that would be a good move. So I wonder if GM2 Gonzalez sees that idea right now as trying to address that. But it'll be interesting to see what happens if black does play queen takes g5. This game is going a lot better than the last one for Zach, I'll say that. Yeah, his development is better, his coordination is better. He has made an undefended piece error, I think, in this position, unless this was all part of his plan, but I kind of doubt it. No offense to you, Zach, if you're watching this, but we'll see if he finds e4. I think okay. Maybe I should take that back. Zach, you played a good move. So e4, great move. It's a double attack. So he's attacking the queen on g5 and the knight on d5. Now, black could try to address that by moving the knight into e3. But then the knight is like very much stuck in Zach's side of the board, and he could play queen e2 and gang up on it. That would be a good move as well because it defends the mate. Notice that black is threatening mate now with the queen and knight combination on g2. Also, queen f3 would be good too for the same reason. So we'll see if he plays one of those moves. I would play queen e2 because, he took it. Okay. So he just got rid of the knight. However, black will take back with check, and now there's no pin that we're able to exploit. Now, this was not bad for white because he did get to develop a piece, and he got to do it just getting rid of it. Now white has a real appreciable advantage in development. However, we didn't really punish black for having to go into the pin. Right, so we didn't capitalize on the knight being totally pinned, which the move queen e2 would have done. Queen e2 would have capitalized that. Even though black could have played f4 then, if you imagine the line queen e2, f4, bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3, what could white play at that point? You can pause your video if you want. In that line, white had the move knight f7 at the end, because the f file would be open for white's rook. So he would be able to play knight f7 with a fork on the queen on g5 and the rook on h8. All right, so here's the game position once again. waiting on black's reply. Wow, and GM2 Gonzalez did not capture the pawn on f5, on e4 rather. He could have done that, but he's actually reverting to development, which might not be a bad decision. Now, Zach, when he played the knight up to e5 several moves ago, he did so with the intention, I believe, of taking the pawn on g6, so I bet he will take that. That would also attack black's rook on g8. He may also do something to like back black's queen off. He might think about playing a move like rook e1 or rook f3, but that would allow the queen to come back and defend the g6 pawn. Let's say like queen g5. Okay, so he grabs the undefended pawn. Good stuff. Now, if black moves the rook, let's say to g8, in order to attack white's knight, then Zach could take on f5 and try to win another pawn. Because after pawn takes back, he could play bishop takes f5, and the bishop would be supporting the undefended knight. So this will be interesting to see if he spots that e takes f5 is possible here. Okay, well, he took a pawn on h4. He played that pretty quickly. So good thing he's getting another pawn. However, the knight's a little loose on this square. Also, there's some question marks surrounding this. And white's king is fairly open now. I mean, he has grabbed a couple pawns, but he's done so on the side of the board where black doesn't mind the position being opened up. And black quickly castled queenside. So we have, what, a position where white is up 1 point, so he has an extra pawn, now potentially 2 extra pawns. But I think black can whip up some counterplay, and Zach will have to be very cautious about that. He's grabbing another pawn here. This opens the bishop's diagonal. Okay, and his opponent has played queen g3 to attack the knight, and if the knight were to move, there's queen takes g2 mate. Well, assuming the knight goes to f3, there would be queen takes g2 mate. Black could use the queen and rook battery to do that. So, tough decision for white because there is the move knight g6 here in order to interfere with the rook and the queen. However, I'm really worried about this bishop because this bishop can participate in the attack on g2 at a moment's notice. So if he's able to play, like let's say knight takes d4, that could be an issue. Okay, so he played knight g6. That's probably a good move. And let's see if his opponent tries to use this bishop in conjunction with the queen by playing a discovered attack move with this knight. We'll see if that happens. His opponent might also think about capturing on f5, but moving this knight now would be very strong for him, like knight takes d4 or even knight e5. Not only would he be threatening mate on g2, there also is a threat of queen takes h3 check, which would use the fact that the g2 pawn would be pinned. So I think if his opponent realizes that, then Zach might be in for some trouble. But no, his opponent plays rook e8. Okay, maybe he was worried about the knight's influence on the e7 square. Now, if I were Zach, given that I'm up 2 pawns now, and my king position is a little precarious, I would be doing everything in my power to try to trade queens. So I'd be looking at moves like queen f3 pretty closely. He played pawn f6, so he's going for the fork here. Good idea. However, I'm not sure he's considering this discovered attack potential. The knight on g6 is also losing a defender. Black could play rook takes g6. Given that this pawn is so powerful, I don't think that matters to Zach too much right now, because he'll just take back, and yes, he's losing 2 minor pieces for the rook. Okay, this is what we feared, knight e5. Oh no, Zach took the knight right away. Okay, I think he just assumed that his opponent had blundered. You see how fast that happened? That was like bang, bang. And yeah, black got him in the checkmate. So Zach, when he got into this position, and I'm sure he realizes it now, he shouldn't have made his decision that fast. For sure, he should not have. He should have took his time, slowed down, and realized, okay, this is a weird move. What is black's intention with that move? And I think if he would have thought about it a little longer, he would have seen that black is double attacking g2. Okay, so a better game for Zach. That's definite progress over the previous game. He did a good job of developing his pieces and coordinating pretty well. He played a little bit recklessly at times, and he was overlooking some of his opponent's threats. So that's one thing that we'll have to hammer with him, and which I'm going to be making aware to him even further, even though he knows that he has a problem with undefended pieces. You know, this was pretty interesting, and these games were actually, on the clock at least, like fairly short. So I'm going to talk to him on Skype again here and see what he says. Maybe he wants to try another one. I would be up for it if he is. I'll tell him that the second game was an improvement. He said, "Of course I forget my knight is the only thing keeping them from checkmate." So yeah, he's right about that. And also, I don't think he considered the bishop on b7. Let's see if he wants to play one more. Hopefully he does. I'd like to give him a chance to maybe get a win on camera. But if, even if he happens to lose all 3 games, it doesn't really matter because these are all for learning purposes anyways. So we'll see if he's game for that. He says yes, he'll play another one. And he says he totally forgot about the bishop on b7 as well. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to wish him good luck again. I said I'll tell him I'm rooting for him to get a win on camera. No, I'm going to tell him to watch his opponent's threats in this game. And if they play an unusual move, stop to think if you can. Okay, and he's already started. He's got Matilda Cat, rated 1001. Let's see if this player plays. Sometimes people will abort the game before starting for one reason or another. Okay, we've got a d-pawn opening in this game. We'll see how black responds. Zach plays d5. I do recommend that black play d5 to beginner players because I think it's a simple move. I wouldn't mess around with too many knight f6 systems. I would get used to playing classically and used to playing symmetrically. Okay, so Zach is playing the Queen's Gambit declined, and he knows that this is an opening where you want to be able to recapture with the pawn in the center. So hopefully he takes to the e-pawn. He does. His opponent plays knight f3. So I hope that black develops his king side first in this game. Remember back to that first game, he was not able to develop his dark square bishop too quickly, and that really cost him in terms of king safety and general position safety too. So he should focus on getting his king side out. Let's see if he remembers that. So playing knight f6 followed by bishop e7 would be a solid course, a solid way to continue. He plays knight c6. Okay, common move. We've discussed this in the past in actually my second chess fundamentals video, the previous video, how this move is maybe not so good, knight c6, because it blocks the c-pawn. And in fact, in this type of structure with the pawn on d5, you'd rather have the pawn on c6 and the knight develop to d7, or have the pawn on c5 and the knight develop behind it so you can exert pressure on d4. So he's kind of breaking the rules a little bit with knight c6. It's not a terrible move. Okay, I like that he's developing now. So he played bishop b4. Perhaps not the best place for the bishop. I think it would have been safer on e7, but he's not wasting much time on development now. And I hope he castles at this point. He does. Okay, good. So already 7 moves in, he's castled. This is very good. White also playing this pretty normally. White's playing a bit passively, I'd say. He locked in his own bishop. That wasn't necessary. He could have strived to get his bishop outside of the pawn chain instead. So that affects White's coordination a tiny bit. Let's see if Black develops the light square bishop. I think Zach should play bishop f5 in this position. And before playing bishop f5, he'd want to check to see if there was some way White could take advantage of the b7 pawn that would be undefended. move like queen b3, but in this case queen b3 is not such a big deal because the queen is blocked from attacking that pawn. So we shall see. I wonder if he's hesitant to move his light square bishop out because he kind of got burned when he did that in the first game. But nope, he plays bishop e6. Okay, solid move. Bishop e6 just defends d5 twice, or 3 times now, rather. So I'm happy with the way this opening has turned out for Zach. It's not perfect. Like, there's things I would have liked him to see do differently. 1, not put the knight on c6. 2, not put the bishop on b4, keep it home on e7. But these are relatively minor things. The main thing is that he coordinated his position, developed coherently. He hasn't wasted much time with pawn moves. If he checks all those boxes, he's going to be doing well, especially in the opening. So now he can either drop his bishop back to like d6 or e7 or trade for the knight. I like the fact that he dropped the bishop back. I don't think there was a compelling reason to take white's knight. So that was a good idea, dropping it back. White's playing very standard moves so far. Pretty good moves, too. I don't see any opportunities white has let slip or really given to black. So in terms of planning, what could Zach try to accomplish now? I mean, there's many ways he can go with this. I would think about a move like a6, just to stop white's knight from coming into b5, where it could potentially harass this dark square bishop. Knight e7, that's also not a bad move too. I think with that move he might be trying to get the pawn to c6, which is where it belongs really in this structure. If I were white, I would jump on this opportunity and play knight b5 right now. I think that would be a good way to take advantage of the fact that black has not played c6 or a6. Instead, white plays rook e1. Hasn't been any big clashes in this game yet. Both players are kind of content to build up their own position. That tends to happen with d4 openings. The battle can be postponed until the middle game sometime. Okay, good. Pawn to c6. I like this. I don't know if Zach was remembering now that the pawn should be on c6 in this setup and he was hoping to correct that, or if he just liked the look of this plan. But I love that pawn structure he has. This is a very coherent pawn structure. There's only one weakness. It's the b7 pawn. It's the base of the chain, but it's not easy for white to get at that point. So his opponent responds with bishop d3. I think maybe he's doing that to try to facilitate the e4 advance. Zach plays knight g6, and white does go e4. Okay. So now if Zach takes on e4, white will end up with this isolated pawn, which will have an impact on the way this game goes. By playing e4, white is opening up his bishop, so his bishop has more mobility on this diagonal. I do think black should take the pawn. By playing e4, white also loses one defender of d4, and black, coincidentally, is attacking that one time. So Zach may be trying to zero in on that in his thought process. Undefended pieces-wise, both sides have been doing great. I mean, I haven't even talked about undefended pieces too much in this one because there hasn't been anything apparent that for either side. So both sides doing an excellent job of keeping their position compact and secure. White takes with the knight. So now the knight is attacking the bishop. I would, if I were Zach, I would think about moving the bishop back to e7, maybe c7, just to save it from being captured and also to open up the queen to attack d4 again. So then he would have the knight and the queen double teaming the pawn on d4. This knight is a concern though because it could jump into g5 or possibly c5, and that bishop on e6 is a potential target. This seems to be a pretty good opponent, like 1001. I mean, he might be a little underrated. He's played fast and he's kept the tempo of the game going. Zach is down a little bit on time, but I hope that doesn't rattle him too much. I should note that Zach is giving up rating in each one of these games. I told him to look for players in the 900 to 1200 range. So he is giving up some rating by playing these. So knight h4. offering to trade the knight. Now, normally, knight moves to the side of the board should be regarded with suspicion, but since he's offering like a direct trade for white's knight, I like that move. If white takes it, Zach would just want to be careful not to take with his queen, because that would leave the bishop on d6 undefended. Right now, the only thing that's holding that bishop is black's queen. So I hope he didn't play that with the intention of taking with the queen. I don't think he did. Okay, and his opponent goes knight g5. Doesn't deal with the threat on h4 yet. So now if Zach wanted, he could play bishop g4 and pin white. Bishop d5 is another option too. But this bishop is attacked twice by the knight and the rook, and it's only defended once. So white would be planning to take it if he could. So Zach should address that with his next move. He might also think about capturing here. Okay, good move, bishop g4. He saw the threat and he pinned white. I like it a lot. The bishop is undefended on g4, mind you, but white is pinned. Now, if you guys are sitting there at home, what do you think about the possibility of white playing knight takes h7 at this point? What do you guys think about that? The idea would be that if knight takes h7, king takes h7, white can try knight g5 check. And after the king moves, ideally white would play queen takes g4. So using a discovered attack with tempo to win the bishop. However, there's a flaw in this line. And I want to see if you guys can spot what the flaw is. There's actually a couple flaws. One of the flaws, if I back up here, is that if that capture happened, black would not have to take the knight right away. They could insert the move bishop takes f3. Also, I believe that in the line knight takes h7, king takes h7, knight g5 check, black could also play queen takes g5, which would lose the queen to bishop takes g5, but then he would immediately get it back with bishop takes d1. Okay, and white played h3, trying to kick the bishop away. Zach traded his knight. Yeah, that's probably a good decision because this knight was like stuck on the side of the board. Now let's see how black deals with the threat on the bishop, because if he moves the bishop back here trying to keep the pin on the knight, his opponent could play g4 and trap the bishop. So I hope Zach sees that. I hope he either takes on f3 or moves the bishop back to like e6 again. I think those would be his best bets. Good game so far. I mean, the difference between like this game and the first game is like night and day as far as how Zach's playing. Just huge difference. He's given himself a real good position to work with for the middle game. Whereas in that first one, he didn't get out of the opening because he made some characteristic mistakes, moving the same piece twice, leaving stuff undefended, moving his f-pawn early. And he's done a much better job of that in this game. Knight f4. Okay. So that move, that's a risky move to make. He's relying on tactics now to avoid moving his bishop. And you guys might see what Zach has in mind with that. So he's trying to attack white's undefended bishop on d3. I like the fact that he's zeroing in on that piece. However, I wonder if he's calculated what will happen if bishop takes f4. Because if bishop takes f4, that's like an in-between move. And wow, his opponent played rook e4 in reply. But if bishop takes f4, he can take back, but then white might have time to take the bishop. I do see that in that line, black could play bishop takes c1, so maybe that's his intention. But I don't think that would be in black's favor. He would be losing two minor pieces for the rook. However, this is really surprising. His opponent played immediately rook e4. Like within like 10 seconds of Zach playing knight f4. Big mistake. He's letting Zach take on d3 immediately if he wants. And when Zach does take on d3, it would hit the rook on c1. So white wouldn't have time to take the bishop on g4. Wow, so big turn of events. Now, by playing knight takes d3, black is going to be going up a piece and setting himself up to win this game, assuming he stays ahead on the clock, or stays all right on the clock. There could be some complications if white had played bishop g5 there, but nope, he just instantly takes on g4. Okay, so now Zach can take on c1, and he'll be up in exchange at that point. Being up the exchange means being up a rook for a minor piece. So that will be his advantage. That rook on g4 is staring straight down at his g7 pawn, but he has that defended. There is a move bishop h6 that could be possible. So that may play into his thought process right now. He moved his rook out of the way and did not take this rook on c1. I wonder if he saw the idea of bishop h6 and was readying himself to play g6. Yeah, unfortunately now it's a double attack. There's two things attacking g7, so the bishop and the rook. And the queen is hitting d3. It's a good move by his opponent, bishop h6. Undefended piece and weakly defended piece. So, I think Zach might want to take on c1, and he does. He is allowing the capture on g7. However, okay, and white took with the rook. However, he can move the king to the corner, king h8. This game's heating up real fast, though. Because after king h8, there's some big problems on h7, too, that I'm noticing. If he plays king f8, he'd be walking right into some discovered attacks. Ironically, that might be his better chance. I don't know. Because now this pawn on h7, it probably doesn't even make sense for white to bother taking this knight. Yeah, he plays knight g5. That's a brutal move. Because now he's attacking f7, and he's added another attacker to h7. I mean, allowing knight takes f7 would be devastating for black, if not immediately losing. So, yikes, what to do? He could play knight e2 check to start if he wanted. But actually, knight e2 check could be met by queen takes e2, even. Although queen takes e2 would allow queen takes g5. We're getting into some complicated stuff now. I think with a minute and a half versus his opponent's 7 and almost 8 minutes, Zach has his work cut out for him right now, and he is getting attacked. He's going to lose the h7 pawn unless he sacks his queen. So I hope he's not too concerned about that. He should be more concerned about the f7 pawn, since that is a mate threat on the spot. So I think like rook e7 would be a decent chance now. Or if not a decent chance, like a move that doesn't lose for him. Okay, Zach is sacrificing his queen. All things considered, I don't think that's a bad decision. Maybe he's seeing that he's in some trouble as far as the attacks on h7 and f7 go, and he is trying to do something to give himself a chance. Okay, his opponent took with the bishop, even though that gave up the rook. Now, interesting little exchange there. You see how fast they both played that? That was super fast. Okay, after bishop takes g5, which I think was much inferior to rook takes g5, by the way, black had an in-between move here that would have allowed him to preserve even more material. So I'm going to back up to that position. Do you guys see what it is? Board keeps skipping ahead. So in-between move for black right here. It was knight e2 check. If Zach had inserted that move before taking the rook, he could keep his knight, because white would have to respond to the check. And certainly in that position, white would not want to take with his queen, because that would lose the queen. Knight e2 check, rook takes e2. So knight e2, white would move the king, and then Zach could take that rook on g7, and he'd be ahead in material. So in-between move, that's another thing that is missed at all levels, especially at lower levels, but really in-between moves are missed at all levels. Now we have an interesting position where, material-wise, it's totally equal. Zach has 2 rooks against white's queen, but Zach has 1 less pawn. So this is a game with increment, so even though he has a minute, he's not out of this entirely. This was a really interesting one. Okay, his opponent played king f1. Now, f4 might be a possibility. I think that's why Zach moved his f5 pawn. I'm just backing up a second just to see these moves that I kind of missed. This is a good example of an imbalance. So even though there's a material balance, there's like a material distribution imbalance. And here it's the fact that white has the queen and pawn and black has the 2 rooks. So Usually the queen would be better than the two rooks when there's lots of weak pawns for the queen to attack, and when the side with the queen has a safe position. And that's kind of the case here. Like if you notice white's position, there's a lot of things that are defended, especially this central cluster. And given that Zach has two attackers here, and he took on f4. I think Zach thinks he has a combination, but the problem is, his opponent takes, and I'm pretty sure Zach is intending rook e1. Problem is he's losing a lot of material by doing this. And by going for this combo, he's going to be in a losing endgame. So that's unfortunate that Zach went for that with bishop takes f4. Now rook g7, but I think the time pressure is kind of getting to him here. But his opportunity to play f4 was on this move, actually. Here it would have been a lot better because it was defended. Okay. So, his opponent replied bishop e5. So this game is now basically lost for Zach. Yeah, he's pinned. He's down material already. This was a very interesting one, though. I'm not going to say like his game is being transformed in the matter of a few games, especially since he hasn't had a chance to hear this commentary or anything. But like I said, the difference between how he played the first game versus this game is huge. Even though he's on track to lose this one, I think if he keeps working on these things we've been talking about, the undefended pieces, the coordination, position safety, so developing a sense of danger, he's going to be getting higher than this, and he's going to be over 1,000 in Blitz soon. And he plays longer Blitz games, so even though this is technically the Blitz category, I think he can pump that rating up, no problem. His opponent has him on the ropes now. The rest of this will probably just be a cleanup job for white. Still, though, moves like a5, that's an unforced error. Just allows his opponent to take the pawn for free. Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of time. He might be on the verge of resigning. But lots of positive things to take away from this one. Most definitely. Just scrolling back through just to see if there's anything major I missed talking about. Okay. And Zach lost. Yeah. Okay. So thank you to Zach for being a gracious volunteer and playing these 3 games on camera. He's a relatively new player, and he's just making his way in the chess world. And the fact that he was gracious enough and even gung-ho enough to do this is really telling. And I think that type of attitude will serve him well in his chess career. So, Zach, I hope you are able to incorporate some stuff that we talked about in this video. And I hope everyone watching this had some things to think about as far as typical mistakes and food for thought. Let me know what you guys think about this one. And thanks for watching this series and this episode of Chess Fundamentals. And I'll hope to be back with Chess Fundamentals number 4 very soon. All right, guys. Talk to you later.